Let us continue with our course on entering the way of the great vehicle. Let me just repeat the prerequisites of attending this course. First of all, you have to already have received Vajrayana empowerments. Second of all, to observe the Samaya vows. Third of all, never slander the Guru and the Vajrayana teaching. Fourth, to maintain the pure relationship with the Vajra Sangha. And fifth is that you have to listen to this course all the way from the beginning to the end. If you can fulfill all of these prerequisites, then you are allowed to attend this class. If you cannot, then it would be the best for you to only listen to the Sutrayana teachings. Otherwise, this Vajrayana teaching would not be beneficial to you anyways if you cannot fulfill all of those prerequisites. This includes the Tibetan reading transmission and the teaching. The answer past profound and wonderful Dharma is difficult to encounter in billions of aeons. I now see it, hear it, receive, and uphold it. I vow to fathom the Tathagata's true meaning, to liberate all beings, thus generate the supreme Bodhicitta.
Devjinder dungur demba nyet kyang kumjong kum sanyille mandi te ndartar martak shepur gir mavartar ndartar gyanam drevela martur taqdar ki kuni shava shet drevegam taqdar gi shava mabshit jin me bartar ta sandi par tenjam dreram jongart magan testa mayende gyogam drevela tum drevegam gelar tu ngusna neverlembi phombo nyed number member tsirgi khur tar Number Dagnit Tribe Dungur Jim Sanya Yen La Tenin Mawana Dungur Mumber Dripianis Jerry Kumjong Jim Sanya Yente Tevena Pomboranga Zamlam de Chu Dome Bar Tokja Nyomumba Tamjespon Dom Zago Jayan Kanzik Shisha number Zhang number Yeva Zhanglin Deba Jigder number Shirte Ter Namla Chu Domer Tober Shina Tedok Tamjan Nyomumbar Pomber Jerwa Dodma Zago Number Chigdona, Ganzak, Mandashina, Kiev, Pa, Shing, Sate, Di, Genji, Shangla, Jerdan, Kieverna, Di Shang Chigla, Jerdan, Kieva, Ne, Shang Nibadan, Sambani, Shang Chirni, Bala, Jerdan, Kiever, Kirna, Jerdan, Tedder Tamchis, Zerchi Yenam, Gunter, the Tated Yen, De la Zerchi Yenana, Shang Chigla, Tarver Chagbe, Jerdan Tamchis, Dober Rignagan, Terta, Mayano, Garte, Tated Reri. Yodna di namjam jupa zamla karam thariyang thigbur jotyang zobur manjerte karte tedar pamar gerna dimtir kachigma rere zirdan rere pangja zaprin gerwam thamarni paran yoro karte nyomomba mambok chig lamchig nyomomba mambo lamchigur pomor gerna lamji shepjong mambo gomna tome paran yoro karte nyomomba chig lam mambo pomor gerna nyomomba shepjong somba tome paran yoro karte lamji shepjong nam Nyomoma Johnson number machine Lamambo Manjer Shibur Gerna Nyomon bar Zechik the young Manjero Tevena Nyomomba Zeki Changiba Mete Tevena Yantu Girtana Nyomon Barnam Power Shaver Ze Madrubso Gonam Papa Japchum Barnamji Nyomoba Chester Ponji Jojena and Derter Japchum Barnam no Ganzala Dagmepi Dagmer Toben Jixola Tavi Dimam can never jiver dear de Nyomombi Joe Chur Tam to the Jiver and Jera Zato, Jixola Tava Tiny Jan, Momba Shanchipki, Semgi season up, Sonumji, So, Satme Panes and Gerte, Dagmetbi, Sheripki season up, Nyomombi Trama Tabret Number and Gerto, one young Trama Zena Yopa Mayano, when our Mulum Latini, Mulum Nawata, Gemalatini, Gemal Nawata, Nikala, Zemeper Gums Honja, Zesitrabat Nawaya, Mubasha, no. Pagba Ranjir Namji Sertana, Tenjam Jerum Jong, Yanlap Journey Gir Goni. Chunit Zab Morto de Kansam Ginyoba Tamjin Tonga Dam Gumbar Pama Mali Bar Pande Ram Shanchip Jim Drevo Tobo Jim Jonwe Testana Temjer Yanlo Churni Wanga Rere Varchit Melam Dam Number Lam Vanir Nis Gerve Ton 왜 방으로 샤비 뇽몽박 식경 정리보 정리 선교로 양양 양락 때다가 레레양 덴바 짐산이찬 인데 너터 마르버 찐지 인도실라소바 몸을 버고니 크르타르도 nombe 당녔던 여베 등을기 덴빔 잔이요 냥도시 지찐지 남버시바 라소바 마오와 등을 몸을 르비오네스 제베 금종금 잔이 덴바 연 마르크 방급에 인도시든 방 고급 덴바 연라 데르남 고브르샤위 셔더 템즈 기 산이 람곰베 람집 덴바 연데 데베나 덴바 지원거 본샤 뉴몽박 직장 집저 쌉겼던 게로 스른더타나야 뉴몽바나 지기랑 미브르존르머니도 남주쇼바 남기 츠르타나 캉슴 뭐 셈당 셈레 쇼와 양탁바 마인 비건접 김산이 연 건더 똑범 산이 연아 건거 존와 마연장 강란 점바 마인데 니보 스톰바 랑르바 잠김 산이 츠바 산니버 산니 옌버 츠바 츠빔 텐돌라 데스타나 뇨모와 남김 산이 땅가르데 뇨모와 남는 여라 게와 신절로 거나바전 임비 슈로 데스타나 뇨모는 강양 더껏 회나 사콩나 쓰리요바라 사당 쓰르당 치강선보요 대락 쓰름 동화는 신절로 동화고 쓰름 동화는 양덕버름 동화고 시감나 니기 차르 또바고 대진덕 잔기 원금 산년라 종화당 점밤 동화는 신절로 동화고 용수 즈버름 동화는 양덕버름 동화고 잔기 원은 니기 차르 동화고 지트빈 탈레 장나 장왕라 양 차니 기즈 머니테 더터는 가르멘 코르로랑 가르담당 코르로당 흑사르와 흑스모 무소 대랑 가르담당 코르로 통화는 신절로금 통화고 가르담담 통화는 양덕버름 통화고 흑사르와는 니키처럼 또바고 지제르와 따바 인데 더터는 가르담 양 제스 접난 코르로 양 제스 접아지나 흑사르와 니키 차르토바 요토 접 롱라 가르텐 코르로 제스 접안 가르담 양 제스 마접나 흑사르와 코르로 니kin 산이 인데 니 차니 메도 가르담 제스 마접라 코르로 마 가르담 제스 접라 코르로 마접바 인영 대진데 대외나 코르로 너와티 녀나 가르메치 이르지 림지 nomba 인데 코르로 넉탄 마접베 대외나 흑사르와건 가르담 니디 엠버 자테 흑사르와 차니메도 대진도 니바 라건 제스 접바 제스 접 용스 접바건 제스 접바지나 근더 똑바건 니키 차르 똑소 롱나 니스 너와티 녀나 랑거랑 랑르빔 산이드 인데 니복단도 마저베 대외나 건더 똑바차 무트로 대외나 뇨몽바 방르샤비 제니퍼 મં교로
Let's continue with entering the way of the great vehicle. This particular text, I think it's very logical. I believe for people who are prolific, who enjoys listening to all kinds of teachings, it would be a wonderful teaching to receive. But for ignorant people, or people who have not studied the various texts and the various teachings from different schools of Buddhism, then it might be rather difficult for you to understand. You may get quite confused. You would probably get extremely confused at all times. Because the teachings that's given over here are not the kind of simple instructions. They're not, for example, Lojang teachings that simply talks about how to train your mind. Therefore, throughout the course of listening to this class, I really hope that you can be attentive and try your best to use your sharpest and most subtle and profound wisdom to listen to this class and receive this teaching. I think that would be very beneficial to you. To me personally, I got ordained at the age of 23, and around the age of 24, I traveled with Phuntsog Rinpoche to a few different places. When I was 25 years old, which was the third year when I came to Laronggar, I received this teaching in 1987. It was during the fall. And Phuntsog Rinpoche at that time was only 55 years old, younger than me right now. And he, at that time, just came back from Mount Wutai and started giving us the teaching in the fall. To me, at that time, I only listened to the classes on Vinaya and Madhyamika, for example. I listened to ornaments of the middle way. Also, I've studied some of the Pramana teachings on the valid cognition, on the treasury of valid cognition, and commentary on explanation of cognition. I had not studied the Abhidharma yet, but at the time I felt it was definitely a very supreme teaching. And I also give some teachings to a few fellow Sangha members. I only had maybe 3, definitely less than 5 disciples at the time. At that time, I only had very few retinues. We didn't really have many people in Laronggar at the time either. When Phuntsog Rinpoche just came back from Mount Wutai, he started giving us teachings on the great perfection of Manjushri. You can look into the commentary that's been compiled together by Toku Tenzin. Phuntsog Rinpoche said that, well, it's really wonderful. We have over about 1,000 people over here to receive this teaching. At that time, we only had about 1,500 people in Laronggar. So all of us, when we received the teaching of Rongzom Pandita, we were deeply touched and deeply shaken inside. So ever since then, I kept on thinking that it would be wonderful to translate this teaching into Chinese language, but I had never really fulfilled this aspiration for so many years. I was really young at the time. To encounter such a supreme and profound Dharma, I really cherish that opportunity. When I think about that, even now, I feel it was such an auspicious incident that I was able to receive this teaching. Sometimes I hear the various stories from Khenpo Rinpoche's senior students. They told me that after gathering with the fellow Sangha members, after the nirvana of Khenpo Rinpoche, at the beginning of their gathering, they would feel extremely happy because they haven't seen each other for a long time. But after sitting together and started to chat about all the time they've had with the Lama and all the things that had happened in their life, then they would start get all teared up. Especially an old disciple told me that when he was still with the Lama, there was one particular incident at a particular place that engraved a great memory in his mind. Therefore, he would revisit that place from time to time. And simply by revisiting those places that he had spent some time with the Lama, he would feel quite relieved. And it feels like that all the afflictions had already disappeared. I myself can echo that kind of experience as well. I also have those experiences. When Panso Rinpoche was giving the teaching of entering the way of the great vehicle, he was rather very young. He was not 60 years of age yet. And it's been so long since the time that he had given this teaching. To think back around those times, I just arrived and studied in Laronggar for only a year or two, thinking about all of those Khenpos, Khenpo Sasang, Khenpo Gardo, Gaba, Khenpo, and so on. All of those Khenpos, they had great merit to stay with the Panso Rinpoche for a much longer period of time. But to me, I still feel extremely fortunate that I've already encountered and met and relied on Panso Rinpoche at a young age. Therefore, I feel I cherish that opportunity a lot. To live in Laronggar at that time was really difficult. The infrastructure and the living environment was very harsh. I had to carry all the wooden boards all the way from the foot of the mountain to Laronggar and then spend a little time during the day to mend the houses, to build the little hut that I'm living. After Panso Rinpoche's class, I would feel extremely happy and then provide tutoring sessions to a group of fellow Sangha members. Panso Rinpoche had only given this particular teaching once in his life. Later on, I've received the oral transmission, the reading transmission from Khenpo Jingwang on the collected works of Rongzom Pandita, but I had never really had any opportunity to give teachings to the others. I remember during the time I was hospitalized in Hangzhou, that's a city around the southern part of China, I had the opportunity to listen to a commentary teaching given by Khenpo Chukcha. I only listened to that once during the time of being hospitalized, but ever since then I had never really had the opportunity until just recently I started to translate this particular teaching. But I think if we were to have great faith to the Dharma, then we would definitely be able to pertain great benefits from the teaching of Dharma. Without faith, of course, you won't be able to get any benefits. Doesn't matter how wonderful the teacher would give the teachings, doesn't matter how supreme the Dharma is, there would be no benefit to be pertained if you have no faith at all. In the words of my perfect teacher, it says that the Dharma does not have a master, which means that the Dharma is there for you to receive and to get. Whomsoever has the greatest diligence, they would be able to become the master of the Dharma. They would be able to receive the Dharma. It is just like the yaks. The yaks, with great diligence, they would be able to have lots of grass from the meadow that does not belong to anyone. But the lazy yaks would not be able to eat those grass at all. So similarly, the Dharma does not have a master. If you were to be diligent, if you were to have great faith, then you would be able to pertain the great amount of benefits, and vice versa. Not only that without faith and without diligence you won't be able to receive any benefits, there are people who have tinted mind stream. They would then mistake the Dharma teachings and turn the Dharma teachings into non-Dharma. It is very much based on everyone's causes and conditions and their karma as well. Anyhow, I don't want to explain too much on that. This particular time to give the teaching on entering the way of a great vehicle, not sure if you'll be able to understand it or not. To me, myself, at this age, I'm giving this teaching for the first time, and it's probably the last time as well. it is not very easy to give this teaching because of my age, my health, and all kinds of conditions. It is very difficult to gather all of the conditions again. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to give this teaching. That being said, my heart is also filled with sadness because when I think about the time of receiving this teaching from Phuntsog Rinpoche, my heart is swelled with all kinds of sadness. Maybe it's difficult for you to understand my feeling, especially those of you who had never met Phuntsog Rinpoche before. Anyhow, that's my feeling right now. Let's get into the actual text of entering the way of the great vehicle. Yesterday, we've already studied that for those of you who want to attain liberation and want to surpass the samsara, one have to generate the mind of renunciation and then generate the mind of supreme bodhicitta. At that time, you have to first observe the characteristic of affliction, because if you don't know what affliction is, then you don't understand how to work with it. And then you won't be able to practice on the antidote. If you cannot practice on the antidote, then there's no way to attain liberation. This is the step-by-step or systematic approach. I believe everyone over here wants to attain liberation, want to part from afflictions. But it is not that if we want to part from affliction, then right away we will be able to attain such kind of result. We don't have such autonomy of attain such kind of fruition. According to Bodhisattva Charyavatara, it also talks about how afflictions generate the greatest amount of harm to all of us, much more so than any external enemies. So as much as we do not want to have any afflictions, but because of our karma and our habitual patterns and so on, we are still spending our time and our life with afflictions. For such reason, we need to see the characteristic of affliction, the nature of it. When we recognize that afflictions, in fact, do not exist based on the kindness from the spiritual teachers and the kindness of the Buddha and the Dharma teaching that they've generously given, then we would be able to work with it. Of course, according to the various teachings, for example, the Shravakas and the mind-only school and the Sautrantrika teachings, each of the teachers, they're really wonderful. They're very great in terms of looking at affliction and examine it, as well as working with it. But over here, we're going to examine what affliction is according to the perspective of great perfection, which would be the greatest power to work with affliction. So let's look at how it is established. Yesterday, we've already talked about how the Shravakas think that the afflictions are truly existent, and we then used the way of examination through whether the afflictions are existent as one entity or as other entities. According to the ornament of Madhyamika, it talks about the way of examine afflictions are not existent from it is neither one or other. Because we talked about if the afflictions are of one entity, then eradicating one affliction would mean that you've already eradicated all because they are of one entity. If they are of many entities and separate entities, then each of the afflictions can be further divided into, for example, the 16 characteristics according to the Four Noble Truths. Also, each of the Noble Truths, for example, the truth of suffering, can be further divided into the four aspects as well, which then would further elaborate into infinite numbers. if we were to use the example of impermanence, then the counter aspect of impermanence, which is permanence and grasping to permanence. But if we think that afflictions are real existent, then the pillars are existent, the same as the vase, the car, the house, and so on. The kinds of true, solid existence of graspings would also be infinite. In that way, there is no way to eradicate all afflictions. So that's the kind of logic we studied yesterday. Let us continue from yesterday. If the opponent were to say that all of the stated above, the permanence and taking the suffering as happiness, everything is not empty and there is a self, all of those in fact are included in the category of suffering, of the truth of suffering. Therefore, it should not be further divided into another four and multiplied by another four and so on and so forth. Because they belong to the same category, therefore they should not be considered of having the fault of being infinite. In fact, in such a way, you're basically saying that the truth of the accumulation of suffering can be considered as the characteristic of suffering as well, because all of the processing karmas are considered of upholding the characteristic of suffering as well. So whatever you feel, whatever you encounter, whatever experience you're having, the noble ones would say that they are of suffering. It is only that some of the so-called happiness, they are processing and becoming suffering. They are probably not suffering yet, or they're simply carrying the characteristic of suffering in a very subtle way. So they have not surpassed the category or the circumstances that is marked of having the characteristic of suffering yet. Because all the defiled are suffering. They do not part a little bit from the truth of suffering. On the other hand, whatever defiled feelings in this world, they in fact all uphold the characteristic of suffering. This is stated by the noble ones. In terms of the truth of suffering, all of the feelings that we have are simply the collection of our aggregates. Because they are the collective feelings of the five aggregates, therefore they are called the truth of the accumulation of suffering. Therefore, truth of suffering, in fact, do not part from the truth of the collection of suffering either. From the causal stage and from the fruition stage, they are named as the truth of suffering or the truth of, and the truth of accumulation of suffering. Therefore, they cannot be divided into the two different categories. They're simply named as such. The non-Buddhist schools, they would state that, well, the effect do not, the effect, in fact, are not correlated to the fruition, and neither does the fruition correlate to the cause either. Cause are being the cause for causes are always cause, and fruitions are always fruition. But this is not what was taught in Buddhism, because in the teaching of dependent origination, we would state that cause is correlated to fruition, and the fruition is also correlated to cause. So the accumulation of the truth of accumulation is correlated to the truth of suffering, the same as the other way around. Therefore, when it comes to the characteristic of the truth of suffering, in fact, they manifest as such is because of the accumulation of the 5 aggregates when they come to maturation. So the 5 aggregates, in fact, are considered as the burdens of the previous lifetimes and all the accumulation of the seeds when they are maturing. They are simply considered as the burdens. It is stated that the truth of suffering is just like a burden that we carry. The people as the one who's carrying the burdens, and the 5 aggregates are the burdens. This is what's taught in the Theravada traditions. So the human beings, in fact, we experience suffering through the 5 aggregates. Therefore, this is called the truth, or this is called the characteristic of the truth of suffering.
这是那个苦地的话呢，就是也是这样的。然后它称为就是这个未来真正形成痛苦的因缘，因此呢，就是叫寂地的发现。
Because it is the source of becoming suffering. Therefore, that is considered as the characteristic of the accumulation of the suffering.
这个产生痛苦。那这个苦地的发现什么呢？就是因为前世的这种艺术呢，就是现在是有我们这个有害的
The truth of suffering is the fruition of the previous seeds that's accumulated through lifetimes. And the characteristics of the accumulation of suffering is the source with a combination of the 5 aggregates, and they would become the source that generates suffering. So that's the characteristic of the truth of accumulation, because they will later cause the fruition of suffering. 前世的这个业力来就是形成的，这样一来呢，就是我们叫这个苦地啊，这是我们学过俱舍论的人呢，大家都应该这个。For those of you who've studied Abhidharma, you probably would understand this statement that it is because we have the 5 aggregates and because they upholds the nature of harm. Therefore, all of the sufferings come from the 5 aggregates, and the 5 aggregates are formed because of the previous karmas. This is called the truth of suffering. How many of you have studied Abhidharma? You can raise up your hand. I'll question you. Now everyone put down their hands now. How did Abhidharma talk about the characteristic of the truth of suffering? Do you remember? 苦地是怎么讲的？哇，大家很那个严肃。Everyone all of a sudden gets so serious. Okay, so let us continue. We've already discussed about how the truth of suffering and the truth of accumulation of suffering are indeed correlated. They are the source of each other and causation of each other.
就这个是最关键的。我们这里为什么他这样剖析呢？他这样剖析的话，声闻宗呢，就是他认为是这个烦恼是
The way that Rongzom Pandita is discussing
如果烦恼有实体的话呢，
the truth of suffering and the accumulation of suffering is to eradicate the wrong view of the Theravada practitioners, where they would uphold the solid existence of suffering or of affliction. If something that has a solid existence, then they would not be changed, because the characteristic has to be set, which means that it cannot transform, it cannot change, cannot become something else. That is the basis. However, according to the Buddhist teachings, if afflictions actually have a solid existence, then it is no longer considered as a dependent arising, because dependent arising needs to be dependent on other things. If there are things that carries a certain characteristic and cannot change, that definitely does not stand any chance of becoming solid, becoming part of the dependent arising. So when it comes to the Abhidharma, the Theravada tradition talks about how there are the 88 or 10 types of afflictions associated to the path of seeing and the path of meditation. In fact, it did not talk about the afflictions in that way according to the dependent arising. Rather, they have solidified the existence of affliction. So without further observation and examination as mundane beings, we would think that the self-grasping and afflictions are truly existent, but that is not true. That is not correct, because there is indeed no true existent thing that is called affliction. Whenever we examine afflictions with our wisdom, we would be able to see that they are indeed just like a dream and just like illusion. They do not exist at all. They're simply like water bubbles. They're simply like illusions. That's the conclusion that we can arrive at the end. Therefore, over here it talks about how simply by knowing and coming to the realization that the five aggregates are selfless and they do not have any intrinsic existence or uphold any characteristics that forms a solid existent affliction or the truth of suffering. They're simply the collective results from the five aggregates. By examining that, we would come to the conclusion that phenomena is without self. Over here, the selfless phenomena includes the selflessness of a person as well. It is more of a general statement. After coming to such kind of realization without any doubt, it would definitely be able to eradicate all kinds of obscurations of afflictions, which means the five aggregates are indeed simply a conjured idea. But after knowing that the five aggregates do not exist, it is to say that after knowing that the five aggregates are simply the combination of things. Therefore, one would be able to come to the realization of selflessness, and therefore that would lead to the understanding of the non-existence of afflictions as well. So in such a way, we don't need to further categorize the five aggregates into the 12 dhatus and the 18 dhatus and 12 ayatanas and 84,000 dharmas and so on. In fact, after making such examination, we would be able to understand all phenomena is without a self. For such reason, we would be able to eradicate all kinds of afflictions. There are two ways to eradicate afflictions. To summarize, one of them is to either work with the five aggregates. The other one is to understand the selflessness of phenomena. One is the selflessness of self, and the other one is selflessness of phenomena. These are two ways of eradicating afflictions. People could understand selflessness through various ways. For example, there are the kind of people who can understand, who can attain this kind of selflessness through understanding things in categories, and there are people who would understand it without dissecting them into categories. Just as the great masters, some of them really prefer to give teachings in summary. Some of them would prefer to give teachings in extensive categories and teachings. In Uttara Tantra Shastra, where it includes the summary, the extensive explanation, and then the summary again. And there are further, for example, examples and various kinds of teachings. It is so that the sentient beings would be able to listen to the teaching so that they can attain understanding through various ways. Anyhow, the two methods are all valid. This particular method over here is through the method of examining the afflictions as an object, and we would be able to come to this conclusion. This particular aspect is from the aspect of taking affliction as an object, and then we further examine on that object. And now let's look at how about if we were to examine it from the angle of the practitioner. The example that's given over here is that if a person's father were to die because of a tree, and then since this person's father died because of a tree for various reasons, this person then generated a great amount of anger of the tree. I think this kind of anger we can all relate to, such as in some movies of the West, if a person's tribe or community were to be destroyed by another tribe or community, then they would have lots of hatred towards the other tribe or the other group. So similarly, if a person's father were to die because of a tree, then this person started to generate great hatred towards trees in general, to one or two or a group of trees or a type of trees. As human beings, we have that kind of attitude a lot. We harbor that kind of unreasonable hatred. For example, if your father were to be killed by a Japanese, then somehow we have lots of hatred towards Japanese people as a group. Or if the father were to be killed by Americans or by Afghans or by Iraqis and so on and so forth, then the human beings would generate a great hatred towards that particular group of people. So this is the example that's given over here. Now let's look at the hatred. Does the hatred that's generated have one entity or of other entities or of different and separate entities? This is a particular teaching given in the ornament of the middle way as well. This is the examination from being one or many. If it has one entity, if the hatred has one entity, then in the exam of a tree, if one tree were to be burned into ashes, that should extinguish all of the hatred that's generated. However, that is not true. If you were to say that the hatred is of one entity, then you would be able to destroy one tree, and then after the tree is gone, then the hatred should be gone as well, because the hatred is of one entity. But that does not happen, apparently. If you were to say that the hatred upholds different and separate entities, then even if you were to discuss the varieties of the hatred, it would take you for a whole kalpa, and you won't be able to come to the extent to cover the variety of it at all. For example, if we were to talk about the trees of the various locations, the trees of the various species, the trees of the various categories, we won't be able to count the various categories and differences and varieties that upholds different differences even for the time of a whole kalpa. So how can we recognize the hatred that can be divided into the various categories? If you want to eradicate such kind of hatred in terms of time, we can look into the hatred that exists at various times and in various time continuance. For example, in 1 second, it can be divided into 60 seconds, and the 60 seconds can further be divided into the smallest units of time. In that way, if you were to say that hatred upholds the entities, even for the shortest unit of time, then you would not be able to eradicate hatred at all, because it is limitless. If with one path that could eradicate many afflictions, then what's the point of practicing on many different paths? There are so many different paths that could be practiced to eradicate the afflictions. For example, according to the Abhidharma, it states that there are the 10, 7, 7, and 8 different categories of practice that's associated to the path of seeing, the path of meditation. If you were to say that one path would be able to eradicate many afflictions, then what's the point of talking about various kinds of practices? You would be able to eradicate all afflictions with one particular teaching, then what's the point of practicing in various paths? You just need one path. If you were to say that many paths would be able to eradicate one affliction, then what's the point of discussing the various categories of afflictions? There are different categories according to Abhidharma, 10, 7, 7, and 8, associated to the path of seeing and the path of meditation. Also, the 84,000 types of afflictions and the categories would be rendered meaningless. If the certain aspects of the path cannot eliminate afflictions, then what's the point of having various kinds of paths? Even many paths would not be able to eliminate afflictions, because even the certain aspects of a path would not be able to eliminate afflictions. If the certain aspects of path can eliminate and can decrease the intensity of afflictions, then the afflictions are indeed not of one entity, because through the practice, our afflictions can definitely be eliminated and be eradicated. Therefore, it means that afflictions are not of one entity, just like how the water drops would eventually become the ocean. with the power of the accumulation of the path, and the power that's accumulated through the path would definitely be able to eliminate and eradicate the afflictions, which means the afflictions do not have any a true existence. Though that the Theravada tradition, the Shravakas, would claim that there are hundreds and thousands of the numbers and categories of afflictions. We, of course, sometimes would claim that there are the 6 root afflictions and 20 dormant afflictions and all kinds of categories of afflictions. But they're simply numbers that we would use in a conventional world. But whenever we engage in the actual examination through our wisdom, we would be able to see that there indeed is no true entity of affliction. Whenever we generate any of the afflictions, anger, greed, arrogance, and jealousy, and all of those, whenever they do appear in front of us, they seem to be real, just like dark clouds. However, whenever you look at its coming and going, indeed, there is no true existence of them at all. Then at that stage, you don't necessarily have to reject it nor to praise it and receive it. At that time, we would be able to recognize the nature of it. I think the worldly beings nowadays, they would use all kinds of beautiful words to describe, for example, greed, and they would talk about how wonderful the so-called love is. They are simply encouraging the growth and simply solidifying afflictions, such as whenever they have anger, they are praised as being brave. Though that afflictions do not have any entity, however, if you were to enforce it through such a way, they would also grow and get stronger and get more solidified. Indeed, I feel Rongzom Pandita uses his wisdom and guide us to also observe the nature of affliction with our own wisdom, so that we can come to the conclusion that out of all the methods of working with afflictions, the great perfection is indeed the most supreme out of all. Some people may have the very partial opinion about Vajrayana. However, if you were to examine with your wisdom, you would come to the same conclusion and you would eradicate all of the wrong views. Anyhow, over here, it particularly this text particularly addresses to the Shravakas' opinion and perspective that afflictions indeed do not have any entities. They are simply named as 84,000 afflictions. However, there are no actual numbers that's associated to them at all. They're simply just the numbers in a conventional way to name them. Now, when it comes to establishing our own school of philosophy, to respond to the opponent on how would you state that the Arhats eliminated the afflictions, then the Arhats eliminated afflictions is not because the afflictions actually have entities. It is because they do not have entities. So over here, Rongzom Pandita started to say that the great noble ones, the arhats, because they've already come to the realization of selflessness, and have eliminated the illusionist that is the view of holding on to a self. Therefore, they have come to the extinguishment of afflictions as well as all the associated illusions. This is extremely important. It is to say that it is not that because afflictions have entities and then the great arhats had to eliminate all the solid existent afflictions. Rather, the arhats transcends afflictions because they have already transcends the view of holding on to a self that is existent, which is really the root of afflictions. Well, does it mean that the Sakyaditi, the view of holding on to an existent self, is corrupted or is considered as negative? That is not necessary. How do we view it then? According to the 400 verses of Madhyamika, it says that though that this body, this transitory collective body is just like an enemy from certain aspect. However, if we were to tame this body or use this body with limitless bodhicitta, then we would be able to create limitless merit, such as people who practice the pure precepts and practice various multitudes of virtuous deeds. Therefore, we can see that this particular transitory collection of a human body is not necessarily bad. If we can use the if we can use the wisdom of selflessness, then it could definitely purify all of the defilements that's associated to afflictions and eventually attain the fruition of Buddhism, bodhisattvas. If we can use bodhicitta, then we would be able to use this body with the bodhicitta to accumulate limitless merit and accumulate, for example, the provision of merit and provision of wisdom. If we were to generate the wisdom of emptiness, therefore we can see that the Sakyaditi is not necessarily terrible. It is only because we started to grasp onto a self and the things that belongs to a self, then we would be able to generate a bodhicitta. We would be able to liberate sentient beings and make the aspiration to attain full enlightenment. If we do not have any graspings, just like a rock, just like any inanimate object, then there is really no way to make a transformation and to use this particular mentality to practice virtue. Therefore, over here it says that the defilements in fact do not have any truly existent entities. However, whenever we are dreaming, it appears as dreams. But according to the Avatara, the Madhyamika Avatara, where it says that when one wakes up, neither of those would appear. As practitioners, in fact, we have a lot to explore around this particular field in terms of how to work with afflictions that has dreamlike appearances. Now let's continue a little bit longer. Our Vajrayana classes would tend to be a little bit longer than the other Sutrayana classes, maybe an hour and 20 minutes. Now let's continue to talk further about the Pratika Buddha Yana, the Pratika Buddha system. It follows the system of, first of all, Shravaka, and then the Pratika, and then the mind only, and then the Madhyamika Sautantrika. And then we'll talk about our own school. In terms of the Pratika Buddha system, since the Pratika Buddhas, they would be able to understand the profound teachings of the Dharma through the understanding of the 12 nirdanas. They would be able to come to the fruition of self-awakening, because the Pratika Buddhists, they were living during the period of time where there were no birth of the Buddha nor of the Shravakas. So they have to practice based on their previous accumulated merits and then attain the fruition of self-awakening. So from the Pratika Buddha system, do afflictions actually exist? They do not either. Why is that? It is because the 12 nirdanas, when it comes to the 12 nirdanas, for example, all the way from ignorance to death, each of the 12 nirdanas, there are the category of the intermediate and liberate path. The immediate path and the liberation path. The immediate path means that the obscurations will be immediately eradicated and fruition would immediately appear. Liberation path means that the obscurations have already been parted. At that moment, it is called the path of liberation. Therefore, if we were to divide or multiply the two, which is the path of immediate liberation and liberation, to that of the 12 nirdanas, then it comes to 24 in total, which means that there are 24 afflictions that's affiliated with the two types of the path. On top of each of them, they can be divided into the characteristics of the Four Noble Truths as well. For example, the becoming of the ignorance, the causes of ignorance, which harbors the nature of being a burden that is harmful, that is the characteristic of the truth of suffering. Each of us, according to Abhidharma, carries this body that is harmful, just like a burden, because we cannot let go of this burden. As long as we're living, we have to carry it. This particular burden has the characteristic of harm, which can be stated as the characteristic of the truth of suffering, because it brings harm, it brings suffering, it brings all kinds of pain. Now, in terms of the karmic formation, which would bring about the future suffering, because it becomes the causation for the future suffering, therefore it carries the characteristic of the truth of accumulation of suffering. After ignorance and karmic formation, there's a consciousness, and name and form, six senses, contact, feeling, craving, grasping, becoming, birth and old age and death. After the whole series of the 12 nirdanas, if the ignorance ceases, then karmic formation naturally ceases as well. Therefore, that is called the truth of cessation. After ceasing all of the afflictions, or in order to put all the afflictions to cease, one should practice the 12 nirdanas, which is called the truth of the path of cessation. So that is considered as the Four Noble Truths that's affiliated with the 12 nirdanas. By multiplying the Four Noble Truths on top of the 12 nirdanas, which would bring about the 48. So in total, there are 48 afflictions that can be eradicated through path. How could there be 12 or 24 or 48 afflictions? If afflictions were to have actual existent entities, how could it be multiplied into 12 and 24 and 28? The fact that it has so many different numbers means that there is no true solid entity that's existent as afflictions. That is why there is no set number in afflictions. Now let's continue a little bit to talk about mind-only school. Whenever we finish mind-only school, we will conclude our class for today, and then you can go to bed. Now let's continue with the Yogacara school, which is the mind-only school. The mind-only school has three major aspects. One is the imputed, one is the dependent phenomena, and the other one is perfect nature. Those are the three key terms that you have to understand when it comes to mind-only school. And if you understand what they mean, then you won't encounter any problems in terms of mind-only school. Later, we will probably study the 20 verses or 30 verses of mind-only school. I think as the practitioners, we really have to study mind-only school, especially if you want to give teachings in mainland China, because mind-only school was very popular in mainland China for a long period of time. So we have to comply with their tradition. The Tiantai school, the Zen school, the mind-only school, we have to comply with their ways of receiving the teachings and then give the teachings accordingly. It is just like if we were to give to be given the teachings to the Theravada practitioners and audience, we need to give them teachings on Agama Sutra and on the four mindfulness and so on, rather than trying to teach them on Vajrayana teachings on the Tibetan Buddhism. It's quite important to comply with your audience, use skillful ways to propagate the teaching, and then then your audience would easily receive your teaching or receive whatever you're trying to communicate. Of course, if you were to have your very special, magnificent powers, that's completely up to you. It's probably easy for you to propagate the teaching in whichever way you like. But I think for a majority of us, it's quite important for us to expand our fields of knowledge and our understanding of different schools of teaching. In this way, we will be able to propagate teachings to various different capacities of the audience. I think whenever we have the opportunity to go out and propagate the Dharma teaching, we have to observe and think about if our teaching would be in accordance to the tradition and the custom and different ways of their understanding. Are they going to be able to receive whatever you're trying to communicate? I think it's quite important to develop the ability to examine, to observe, and then to give teachings appropriately so that the other party can receive it. That being said, we're going to, in fact, negate what the mind-only school proposed over here. The mind-only school, since they talk about how the mind and mental factors of the three realms are simply imputations. The mind and mental factors, as you may know, mainly the Yogacaran school talks about the mind being the collections of the six consciousness or eight consciousness, and then the mental factors can be divided into 51 mental factors. All of those are considered as imputations. They're simply imputed and false conceptions. They're neither the apprehender or apprehended. The only thing that is valid, according to the Yogacharans, are the perfect nature, which is devoid of apprehender and apprehended, devoid of self and other. The experience of that is considered as perfect nature. So to sum it up, when there is still apprehender and apprehended that is considered as dependent arising, the untruthful mind and the mental factors are considered as as the imputation, the imputed and false conceptions, the mind that is devoid of any apprehender and apprehended is considered as, or is called as a perfect nature according to Yogacarans. And over here, Rongzom Pandita says that, well, if you were to claim that there are three aspects that's affiliated to afflictions, that is incorrect. Why is that? It is because afflictions, in fact, occurs because of the mistaken grasping towards the object. However, since you are talking about it from the angle of perfect nature, then it is incorrect, because even the dependent arising would not stand a chance in that argument. Why is it so? Now, to further discuss this, Rongzom Pandita gives an example. It is just like a piece of gold is hidden underground. And there are the three things that's discussed over here. So the soil, the gold, and the ground. To perceive the gold being simply a piece of mud or soil, it is not seeing the truth of the nature of gold. You're simply seeing the soil, where you are looking at the rocks or this piece of soil as the false perception, which is imputation. And by seeing the gold as gold, it is the perfect nature, because you're seeing what is as it is. The earth, when it is still together, when the gold and soil are still together in the ground, it is both the ground and the soil, so that it pervades the two aspects, both gold and soil. That's according to the Yogacaran school as the dependent arising, because it is all pervasive into the two aspects. Now, it must be really easy for you to understand when the mind has both apprehender and apprehended, it is called the dependent arising. When through this dependent arising, if you can perceive the truth as it is called perfect nature. At the time when it has apprehended and apprehender, that is the imputation. This is really easy to understand. To correspond with the example, when it comes to the three characteristics associated with the Yogacara school, the nature of the mind, which is just like gold, this is called perfect nature. The soil that covers on top of the gold, this is called dependent arising. But this dependent arising, it covers both the gold as well as part of the ground. Therefore, it is called. So the soil that covers the gold, that blocks the nature of it. So the false perception is called imputation, and then the gold part is called the perfect nature. The dependent arising, the dependent phenomena is all pervasive into the two parts, which is earth. You have to remember this and understand it, because I will put it into our exams. Now we can see very clearly that Yogacaran school in fact claims that dependent phenomena pervades two aspects. One is the pure aspect, and then the other is the impure aspect. The Yogacarans thinks that the apprehender or apprehended, the sixth consciousness, the aspect of recognizing the nature of mind is perfect nature. And that perfect nature is also part of the dependent phenomena. So that is called the pure dependent phenomena. However, when it comes to the diluted aspect, where you don't perceive things as they are, that is considered as the imputed aspect. That is the part that belongs to the samsaric aspect, where there is still apprehender and apprehended. Now, in this way, they would feel that the dependent phenomena both pertains to the samsaric aspect and the nirvana aspect. It both has the pure aspect and diluted aspect. If you do not use the wisdom, the sharp wisdom of Rongzom Pandita, you would probably feel this is very much correct. Our mind is just like being covered by the soil, and it has both pure and impure aspect. However, let's further discuss this idea through the example of a firebrand and a fire wheel. I can use my prayer wheel as an example. If I move it, now you can see that it becomes a wheel. But unfortunately, since it does not lit with the fire, it doesn't have any light, therefore I can't really demonstrate the fire aspect of it. But when it's rotating, we would be able to see a circle. The circle aspect, or the circled fire aspect, the brightness aspect, is pervasive to both of the firebrand and the fire wheel. However, the fire wheel is simply the deluded perception. It is simply the imputed and false conception. If we were to say, okay, so the firebrand is real, the fire wheel is also real, then the luminous can be pervasive over the two aspects. Then, without further examination, we would feel that's correct. However, if we were to examine it, then we would be able to come to this conclusion that there are two fires that pertains to one to the firebrand and the other one to the fire wheel. In this way, you're simply saying that there are two lights or two fires. If you were to say that the fire wheel is real, but the firebrand is not real, then we're simply saying that the luminous, the light, is the characteristic of the fire wheel, which does not have two aspects, which does not pertain to both of them. At this time, I think you have to pay attention, because this is also considered as false according to the Yogacara school as well. Because if you were to say that the fire wheel is truly existent but not the firebrand, then the light should only be luminous when it is in the form of the fire wheel. Because if it is truly existent, then it should be bright at that time, but not the other way around. That is not possible. If you were to say that the firebrand is true, which is considered as the true perception according to the Yogacara school, then similarly, according to the same logic, then the light should only appear when it is in the form of a firebrand, but not in the form of a fire wheel. The brightness would not happen at all at the stage of when you're using the firebrand and turning it into a fire wheel at all, but that is not true. However, according to Yogacara school, if we were to logically understand and examine their statement, then you're simply saying that the fire wheel is just like the child of the barren woman that does not pertain any true existence. So in this way, they're simply splitting luminous aspect of this as the two, which cannot be divided into the two at all. Similarly, our afflictions is exactly the same. The nature of our mind is luminous. It is devoid of any apprehender and apprehended. So the apprehender and apprehended aspect is just like the firebrand. It is simply imputed and a false conception. It cannot be divided into two. Affliction cannot be divided into two. The dependent phenomena cannot be divided into two. The two same as affliction and the nature of the mind. It cannot be devoid. It cannot be divided into the two. It cannot be divided into the apprehender and apprehended. I'm not sure if you'll be able to understand it now. But if you understand, for example, if you watch the movie movie or a flip book animation, you would understand that all of those kind of turning things and the series of pictures are simply just the fast movement. They are simply the delusion from the quick motion. The firebrand does not, the fire wheel does not exist at all. As we've discussed earlier, the fire wheel, if it is true, same as the firebrand, then the luminous aspect should pertain to both of them, and the brightness should be divided into the two as well. To put that into the context of affliction, that means when we perceive things as false conception, whenever we have false perception, then afflictions should follow it. But the false perception is simply imputation. It does not truly exist. Therefore, you cannot divide that dependent phenomena into the two aspects. It is like to say that if a person were to follow two people that's walking towards two different directions, as a person, you cannot follow both of them at the same time because they're walking towards two different directions. You can run around and follow one at each time, but you cannot follow both of them at the same time. However, as we further discussed earlier, the apprehender and apprehended are simply just like the child of a barren woman or the fire wheel, which do not exist at all. Therefore, there is no way to say that you can follow either of them. So you cannot divide affliction into the two. This is really helpful when it comes to eradicating afflictions. Whenever you try to divide, oh, this is the apprehender and that is the apprehended, this is the subject that is generating the affliction, that is the object that generates the affliction. At that time, you should understand that the apprehender and apprehended are simply the fire wheels. They are no other than the confused perception. There is nothing else other than the confused perception. There is nothing truly existent. I think this would be a really good question to ask those Dharma masters who study Yogacara school of philosophy, and simply ask them what are the examples that pertains to all three aspects of dependent phenomena and imputation and perfect nature. Maybe they have never studied an example that is described over here in Entering the Way of the Great Vehicle. Anyhow, I believe this particular example has such profound meaning in it. I really hope that you do not only feel quite satisfied with studying this example. I hope you can use this example into your practice and elimination of your afflictions. Because all of the apprehender, apprehended, the subject and object of generating any afflictions, they're simply the dualistic phenomena, dualistic existence that are simply imputations. Therefore, afflictions themselves, according to even Yogacara school, cannot be truly existent either. So we'll stop here today.